Project Pocket Butter. Today we're going to chop the top off this thing, probably piss off some purists. I expect this to be the most controversial episode of this whole series. So come with me as I start hacking into this thing. As a reminder, in the last episode, we took delivery of this 1931 Buick Series 90 coupe. We're having a good time with it so far. Got it unloaded, got it shipped down here, and got the body off the frame. And now that the body's been off for a week, I've had time to crawl in it, look inside, see what's weak, see what needs to be braced, and try to get a game plan together for how to tackle this thing. Because you have to remember, I want to make a Lakester. I want the top cut off. The top's going away. So I just wanted to understand a mental game plan of how to tackle this thing, because that's kind of the issue I've had. I've never worked on a car before like this. I've never done metal work. I didn't know what to do or where to start. So I think for me, I had to understand the structure of it, see how they built this thing 100 years ago, and mentally take notes of where if I cut the top off, how would it expand or stretch or fall apart, so I could get a game plan around putting in some bracing and holding it together as I worked on it. So as you can see here, it's sitting on the floor on dollies. It's off the frame. The frame's gone. We sold that thing to recoup some money. And now I've had time to crawl into this body and see how it was built 100 years ago. That's kind of the first step, is just understanding the car and how it was built. And with digging into the body, you crawl in there, you see that some things are overbuilt, over-engineered. That's how they did it in the 30s. And some things are pretty flimsy. So you take a look at it and try to take mental notes of, if I cut the top off this thing, will it stay together? And if it won't, where do I need to add bracing? So that was kind of the first steps for me, is to try to understand where I needed to brace it so that I could just chop the top off. Again, you can see that there's no trunk on this. There's no jump seat or whatever this car had. That's just completely missing and gone. All that's left is an open hole for the back. And after getting inside this thing, you can see that there's pillars on each side, kind of like where the B pillar would be in a new car. And then right behind that, kind of a C pillar, but it's not really one. It's kind of superficial. It goes up, and there's a body line that goes around the whole car. And it seems like when they stamped this back in the day, that they chose to use that seam as the structural point, and also clearly aesthetic, but it's also serving as a structural point for this body, so that all the curves tend to build up to that body line that goes around on the inside and the out. So it is interesting to see that how the inside panels and the outside body both terminated as they went up into that body line going around. I took those cues as that's the places that I need to brace to make sure that when I cut the top off this thing, it wasn't just going to fold out and fall apart. So on the front, by the where the dash would be, there's two bars that come up on each side. So I put a bar across there, and then right by the door jamb where the B pillar would be, across there, and then in the back where there would be a C pillar, but I put it across there, so that there's 3 sets of braces. And in the front, because it was a pretty solid horseshoe around the dash, that was pretty solid, so it was just 1. And then in the back I put 4, so 2 on the B pillar and 2 on the C pillar. So basically I had 5 braces throughout, and I was in there tugging on this thing. And for the bracing, I used 1-inch square tube with an 1/8 inch wall, so really thick stuff. I didn't think it was going to bend and twist as I cut the top off, so we went with the thicker material that we ended up reusing elsewhere in this project after it was cut apart, and we removed those, so the metal didn't go to waste. You can see in the back side before the trunk, there's these 2 vertical supports that I guess in 31 they provided a little bit of twisting rigidity, but they really weren't doing anything. In reality, when I started moving inside the body and put my bracing in, that I pulled on them, they were barely in. So if they did anything, maybe to stop luggage from flying forward when you braked, maybe they served that purpose, or if there was a jump seat in this car, maybe it was to prevent people like their feet coming forward, like there was a false wall or a wall back there. But those two braces that kind of made a triangle really added no structural support. So I ended up cutting those out to loosen them up before chopping the top. I didn't set up a camera for this. I thought I was going to, but everything started moving so fast when my father and I started cutting into the top. We were kind of so excited I forgot to set up a camera and take like a time lapse or something of this part. But we took the Sawzall and cut off wheels and lopped the top off this thing, and you can see the top is just on the floor now, set up against the wall. It came off really cleanly. We just followed the body line all the way around and then cut by the window, I guess window frame, we cut there. So all that was really left after we cut this off was the two window frame pieces that came up from the dash, from the cowl, and all the way around about an inch all the way around from that body line that we said we were going to follow. So I thought it looked best if you kept that body line, because we were debating if you should keep the body line or not, because when you look at a lot of Roadsters and Lakesters, they were cutting them all over the place. There's no standard. I liked the body line, so we kept it, and we rolled with keeping that bubble body line on the outside. And you'll see that it's kind of open. It looks like there's two gaps there, but that's the body line we kept. We kept that bubble going all the way around. The window frames were pretty stout on the driver and passenger side doors. I would say that was probably unnecessarily the most structurally sound part of the body. I don't know if that's just how manufacturing was back then, but the metal was the thickest out of the entire body, where you would have cranked the windows up and down on passenger and driver side. For some reason, that frame was heavy. Out of the whole top, that was the thickest metal and most doubled up and tripled up in some cases sheet metal that they stamped and just sandwiched 2 or 3 layers together to make that window frame. I don't know. I doubt they made bulletproof cars back then, but this is something that if you were to put like a bulletproof glass in there, I guess it could have held it. I mean, it's ridiculous how the window frame was the strongest part of the top. It didn't make sense to me, especially when there was no rollover crash testing or anything back then. I think it was just a product of, that's how they built cars back then. The materials they had and how they stamped things, the window frame on each side, 2 and 3 layers thick of steel. So it was just fun to cut through the window frame. It was probably the hardest part. We went through a few blades just cutting the window frames off. And you can see what we're left with is kind of like I've always had boats in my life. It kind of looked like a boat. I'm like, oh great, we just created a boat. What did we do? Because just the way it was shaped, and then you take a step back and you're like, is it too low? Is it too high? But there's no turning back now. And then once those fears calm down, then you start thinking about, okay, what do we do? How do we start adding some strength back to where we chopped it and make another game plan to help fix this situation? And this really changed the whole attitude of the build. Taking the top off gave it new life. Not that I didn't dislike the hard top. It just looked weird to me, that hard top. It looked like a top hat from, Lincoln days where they had that tall hat. The hard top version of this car is not attractive. I didn't think it looked good. I couldn't wait to cut the thing off. And even though as soon as you cut it off, you take a step back and look at it and you're like kind of shocked what you just did. It looked a million times better. So I was glad to cut it off and get rid of it. We ended up throwing it in the back of the truck, looking at it, seeing if it had any good metal to take off it to possibly reuse. There was a lot of patchwork in it. It had some pitting and some holes in it. It just went to the recyclers because I thought maybe save the window frame, do something cool with that, save some of the metal, reuse it somewhere in the body or when I'm ready to do the new floor so that it had original metal still. But I just didn't want to deal with it. And honestly, it wasn't worth any value to me. And this is where I think the purists are going to be pissed off. I mean, as you see it right here, I didn't cut anything off it to reuse it, brought it to the recyclers and got rid of it. I mean, whatever. I didn't care. I got my money's worth out of this body without that top. And now that the top's off, I was looking for ways to add strength back, cap that back side where that seam line now exists, to put something on it to connect the inner and outer structure of the body and then wrap all the way around. So I was looking at how they did it in the 30s on the convertible version of this Buick, and it looks like they used the same body line. They wrapped to a top around that body line and had a flat surface. So I thought, oh, that's easy enough. I started cutting some cardboard templates and then transfer that to sheet metal, and I got to work. And this is probably a little out of order, but this is the second time that I welded this project. So when you see this stitch welding that I did for this part of the body, I used a cardboard template, cut out some strips to then lay on top of that body line after I cleaned it up and ground it to where I needed it to be, and then slowly stitch weld in the new cap to each side. Because remember, I was worried about this body just separating and splitting. So we have the inner structure supports holding it together. I knew that the radius of the body needed to be a support structure in of itself. So my first project on this body after the chop was to add back that cap and continue from the driver and passenger doors all the way around and connect that metal so that the structure that we cut out that was providing the connection between those two sides, the inner skin and the outer skin, was back in place so that I felt more comfortable with this body not twisting over time. And this whole time I'm getting familiar with metal tools and metalworking. Got a lot of flap wheels and learning the grits that to use and not to use. Some are too aggressive, some are not aggressive enough. So I ended up going with like 60 grit to 36 grit in a lot of instances to grind off the welds. Some wire wheeling to get this paint off, because whatever primer or paint they put on this body from the previous guy who was working on it, it smells terrible when you try to grind it off. So we found a wire wheel instead of sanding gets it off the fastest with the less dust. Well, at least somewhat. Still a dirty mess, but the wire wheel seems to do the best job with the smallest mess and cleanup. So you just clean it all off, clean that primer off, and then get to work and welding. So now that the passenger side and driver side caps were put in, and I followed that body line all the way around, the body line on the back side where those caps ended and kind of naturally went into the body line, I needed to transition those. So you'll see that on both sides, I tended to do like a smooth curve transition into the body line. And then I was looking for metal to try to fill in that back body line, because if you got in the middle of it and kind of wiggled it, it wasn't all that strong. So I was trying to think of ways to add some material from our curve that we created, this two caps on both sides all the way around, and something that I could work with as a novice not knowing metal. I ended up using 1/4-inch solid round bar and used my vise and put it in there and bent it and tacked it in place all the way around. So you'll see that there's a nice rolled edge on that whole lip going from the caps on both sides all the way around, that kind of horseshoe back half. It's a rolled edge because I used that 1/4-inch round bar, which really, after looking at it a year later, 2 years later, I can't think of a better solution to wrapping something or adding material to add strength and give it a good look. As we get into working on other projects in that area in the future, you'll see that it really paid off. I mean, that the structure is solid. So after I put in that 1/4-inch round bar, and connected it to the two caps along that body line, you can tug and pull on this thing, and the body no longer does this like kind of stretching and flexing by the door jambs. Those two caps and that 1/4 inch, you can tug and pull and push on this thing as hard as you want, and all the strength is back into the body. So I'm glad I tackled this project first so that I can add back some rigidity to the body where it was needed. We lost all that when we chopped the top off. And without a top on this thing, it needed to have that strength back, because as you see, I welded the doors shut both inside and out before we chopped this. And it's not much, but on the outside, there's a couple stitch welds on the door jamb itself. On the inside, there's a nice plate to hold the doors shut. So after the top was gone and the window frames were gone, all this is kind of holding together with the bracing on the inside up until the very last minute. After we chop the floor and get this thing on the body and then rebuild the floor, those braces are in the way. They're a pain in the ass, but they're there the whole time to make sure that this body stays together. And it all started with that top part around the body line on the back. So on the sides and the back, it wrapped around. All the strength stems from there and the way this body is. After the caps were on and my 1/4 inch round bar was in place, I started gutting some of the interior stuff that I wasn't going to use, like the regulator for the rear windows. I cut those out. They were rusted through and through, falling apart as you're just taking the rivets out. You'll see that I decided just, hey, forget it. I'm not even going to try to salvage anything and cut out the welds that held these regulators in. I just cut squares and removed them. And then I was confident enough in sheet metal welding that I just cut new patches in and put them in. That worked out really well. So that's the back half. Now the front half of adding some structure back and some strength back into the doors is the next step. I had both the driver and passenger side back half patches put in place. I wanted to do the same to the doors so that the doors could have some strength, because after cutting the door frame off, and remind you that those were 2 or 3 layers thick of metal, these doors were super flimsy. So I knew immediately that I had to get the patches back on top of each door so that the doors and the body itself had some structure back, so that things weren't moving around too much as we moved the car in and out of the driveway and back and forth and around, leaning on it. I didn't want to bend anything or risk it, so that was the next step of this project. And you can see it was the same process as the back. I took out the window regulators and locks and door mechanisms on each door, just cut them out. Didn't even want to deal with it. All of it was going to be replaced in the future. So all that original hardware that was just completely rusted out is gone. Patchwork was created and put in place of it. And then I started working on the patches for each door. So it was the same thing as before. Make some cardboard templates and then transfer that on the sheet metal, and then cut out your sheet metal and then tack it into place, and then do the same thing, stitch welding all the way around to transfer heat and spread the heat so that it's not all concentrated in one place. And while I'm on the doors, I did a couple quick projects. I shaved the old lock mechanisms. This thing is chop top, completely open now. It doesn't need door locks. So I shaved the door locks. I shaved the door handles. I thought I did a pretty good job on that. I've never done this before in my life. And after just pounding on some sheet metal, bending it, looking at the hole, just tacking some metal in, and then using the flap disc to smooth it out. After you add a coat of primer, you can't even see these door handles or the lock mechanisms at all. I thought I did a pretty good job. I was proud of myself for this one. You can probably notice in the photos that the doors are still welded together. They're going to stay welded together until the floor is completely done. So probably 6 to 8 months in this project, those doors are shut. So there's hardware in there from the old bear claw and 1930s. It looked like a door hinge type of a pin mechanism. Those stayed in there until 6 to 8 months later when I finally got to them, when the floor was done. So ignore those for now. They will be cut out. I reworked the entire door jamb on both sides when I was able to, so after the floor was in place. The last part of cutting the top off this was to remove the front windshield frames. So here's a photo of what that part of the metal looks like on an actual convertible from the 30s. They actually took that body line and it went down the body and then naturally curved up and around the dash area, and there were no pillars. So I cut those off. This was the most challenging part for me, not knowing what I'm doing. I got a cut-off wheel and just cut those pillars off, and then looked at photos from the 30s and said, how can I replicate this with sheet metal and my welding abilities and the tools I have? And you can clearly see I cut each of the pillars out. There's nothing there. And I slowly took some tin snips and some sheet metal and patched together what I thought would wrap around and look good, just like the factory did. And I really just zoomed in on some photos of 31, 32 convertible Buicks and how they carry that body line around. With my new pie cuts, I did some hammering to bend them and slowly just patched it in. I started with the passenger side because I was just working on that side anyways for the door. And it's kind of a hodgepodge, but the one thing I learned about welding and body work was you can always just grind it off and replace it again and cut it and start over, and you're not hurting anything. That's something that I had to get comfortable with, not being a body person, not knowing how to work with metal. It was getting out of my comfort zone of, did I make a mistake? And then I kept realizing that even if I did, I can grind it flat, cut it out, and try it again. So this passenger side, you'll see there's a lot of weld in there, but after you grind it out, and then a lot of small pieces that were kind of unnecessary, where by the time I got to the driver's side, I learned an easier way to do it on the passenger side. And that easier way was taking some more time with bending your initial pieces and using more patience with the grinding wheel and making them fit better before you tack them in. I learned that lesson. So I worked on this passenger side a few times, finally got it to a place that I thought looked good, and then learned how to shape two curves at once, because that was kind of the tricky part here, is I had to go up from the door to, I guess that's like a concave shape, but then also curve a little bit in. So you're twisting concave and then a little bit in. It was tricky. I never have worked with metal like that before, but a little bit of tacking, a little bit of hammering, a little bit of tacking, a little bit of hammering. I got the job done. And that body line that goes around continues to the front cowl, and it actually keeps continuing onto the hood and goes all the way to the radiator and kind of fades away at the radiator. But I carried that line on the cowl from the front up and over, and then from the door up and over. So it kind of does this on the door. And that was an interesting design choice for 31, I thought. It's pretty complex, probably unnecessary. They could have just made a smooth cowl, but Buick decided to do that. It's probably some cool artistry for the metalworkers back in the 30s. And I wanted to pay homage to that and continue that body line, because I could have been lazy on this job and just continued the body line straight and said, screw the cowl, and just did a flat piece. But I really liked how the front and back on the originals did like that nice curve where it joined to like an 1.5 to 2-inch strip that goes along the dash. So I replicated it, and it turned out good. I'm glad I did that. And you'll see that the window frame has like a channel that goes across the front. And in the 31s that were convertible, they didn't have that. They had that was plated, so it was kind of covered. So it didn't have a channel for a windshield on the convertibles. They used like hinged windows that were just mounted to the cowl, and it wasn't necessary. So I did the same thing. I figured if it looked cool if I eliminated the window channel all the way down, by carrying that seam, the body line that went like this, and then it was a straight shot that wrapped the whole cowl. So now it's a nice transition from the body lines on the side up to a curve, and then that 2-inch strip basically goes all the way down to the other side where it connects with the other body line. A funny thing is, if you haven't done this before, you're overwhelmed with how terrible it looks, and then you're unsure of your metal work until you're grinding all the welds back, and then that coat of primer that you put on, to protect it, of course, but it shows that you did something well. That's the best part for me, and never doing this before, is you're questioning yourself and you're questioning your welds and your grinding. Is the shape right? You never really know until you clean all the welds back and then put that coat of primer on it and see what you did. I mean, I was floored when I sprayed it. You're not supposed to be proud of yourself in life. Let somebody else tell you did a good job. But I was telling myself, damn, I did it. I can do this metal work. If I can do it, anybody can. So I thought it was really cool that after I got the primer on, it was so satisfying to see some shape and some character and following the body lines and then comparing it to a 1931 and how they did it. I was just blown away that I was able to do it. I think it's just trying and doing and trying and keeping at it when you think you're not going to do it or you're going to fail. I just kept pounding on it slowly, a little bit of tacks and bending metal and then grinding it all flat and then primering it. It just blew me away. Well, that's enough body work. I'm exhausted with it. That was about 2 months worth of work, learning metal work, learning to weld, doing some lessons learned about how to shape and mold and cut. I had enough. So we got this project to a place where the body is able to be pushed over in the garage, and then we're able to move on something fun. We start the frame next video, and that's the next few months of this project is working on the frame, the suspension, and getting the frame ready to mate back up with this body that we just spent a couple months shaving and working and chopping the top off. See you then.